Grossinger's Resort, Catskill Mountains, New York. May 23, 1951. Wednesday afternoon, 4 p.m. The legendary training facility, known for hosting boxing's greatest champions, is unusually tense. Two men are about to share the same training space, separated by a generation, by reputation, by completely different philosophies about what makes a fighter great. In one corner, Rocky Marciano, the undefeated heavyweight contender, 27 years old, preparing for the biggest fight of his career against Rex Lane in July. 43 professional fights, 43 victories, 38 by knockout. A wrecking ball disguised as a human being, crude but devastating, relentless but technically limited. In the other corner, Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, the greatest heavyweight champion in boxing history, 37 years old, attempting one more comeback after retiring 2 years earlier. 66 professional fights, 63 victories, 51 by knockout. The man who defended his title 25 times, who knocked out Max Schmeling to become a national hero, who represented technical perfection in the boxing ring. And in approximately 30 minutes, these two legends will have an encounter that neither planned, that will reveal truths about strength, about technique, about the difference between power and skill. An encounter that Joe Louis will never forget, that will haunt him for the rest of his life. The morning had started routinely for Rocky. He arrived at the resort at noon, did his road work through the mountain trails, worked the heavy bag for 6 rounds, then began his strength and conditioning routine. Rocky's training was unique for the era. While most boxers focused primarily on boxing-specific drills, Rocky incorporated intense weightlifting, explosive movements, and conditioning work that modern fighters would recognize but 1950s purists considered unnecessary. His philosophy was simple. Boxing is about breaking your opponent's will through relentless pressure. The better conditioned you are, the longer you can maintain that pressure. The stronger you are, the more devastating your punches. Technique matters, but not as much as the ability to keep coming forward no matter what. Joe Louis arrived at 3 p.m., having driven up from New York City where he had been doing media appearances to promote his comeback. His team had reserved the facility for the afternoon, not knowing Rocky Marciano was already there training. When Louis walked into the main gym area and saw Rocky destroying a heavy bag with combinations that made the chains rattle and the building shake, he stopped and watched. For several minutes, he observed this younger fighter, studying his style, analyzing his movements. And what he saw both impressed and disappointed him. The power was undeniable. Every punch Rocky threw had bad intentions behind it. But the technique was rough, unrefined, wasteful. Rocky threw punches from angles that generated maximum force but left him off balance. He bull-rushed forward with his head down, relying on his iron chin to absorb counters. His footwork was functional but inelegant, more stomping than dancing. To Joe Louis, who represented the pinnacle of boxing science, Rocky Marciano was a primitive throwback, a brawler who succeeded through toughness rather than skill. Rocky noticed Joe Louis watching him and stopped hitting the bag. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the gym. Rocky knew exactly who this man was. Every boxer in the world knew Joe Louis. He was the standard, the measuring stick, the fighter everyone was compared to. But Rocky also knew that Joe Louis was 37 years old, 2 years removed from retirement, coming back because of financial problems rather than competitive fire. Still, respect demanded acknowledgement. "Mr. Louis," Rocky said, walking over with his hand extended. "It is an honor to share this gym with you. I have studied your fights. You are the best there has ever been." Joe shook Rocky's hand, his expression neutral but his eyes evaluating. "Rocky Marciano, right? I have heard about you. They say you hit like a truck. They say nobody can stand up to your pressure." Rocky nodded, unsure where this conversation was going. "I do my best, sir. I believe in coming forward, in breaking my opponent down. It has worked so far." Joe smiled slightly, but there was something in that smile that was not quite friendly. "It has worked so far because you have not faced anyone who truly knows how to box, who understands angles and timing and how to make a strong man look slow and clumsy. You rely on strength, on conditioning, on being tougher than your opponents. But strength is not everything in boxing. Technique matters. Skill matters. And from what I just watched, your technique needs serious work." The words hung in the air, respectful in tone but devastating in content. Rocky's team, who had been working in another area of the gym, stopped what they were doing. Joe Louis's trainer, who had just entered, sensed immediately that something significant was happening. Rocky's face showed no anger, just curiosity. "With respect, Mr. Louis, I have 43 wins, 38 by knockout. My style may not look pretty, but it wins fights. I break people. That is what matters in the ring. Who cares how it looks if the other man cannot continue? Joe Louis's expression hardened. You break people because you have not fought anyone who can expose your weaknesses. You come forward in straight lines. You load up on every punch. You drop your hands after you throw. Against a skilled boxer, someone with real ring intelligence, those habits get you knocked out. I have been in the ring with 66 professional fighters. I have seen every style, every approach. And I can tell you with certainty that power without technique is just potential waiting to be wasted. Your strength means nothing if you cannot land cleanly on someone who knows how to move, how to counter, how to make you miss and make you pay. If you want to discover what happened when Rocky Marciano's raw power philosophy collided with Joe Louis's technical mastery, when these two legends tested their beliefs against each other in a confrontation nobody saw coming, stay with me until the end. What unfolded in that gym on a Wednesday afternoon in May 1951 reveals truths about boxing that still matter today, about whether technique can overcome physical advantages, about what happens when the old guard faces the new generation. This is not just about two fighters. This is about two competing visions of what boxing should be. And only one of them would prove correct. Rocky Marciano stood there, processing what Joe Louis had just said. Part of him wanted to defend his approach, to explain that his style had been carefully developed with his trainers, that it played to his strengths while minimizing his weaknesses. But another part of him, the competitive part, the part that had driven him from poverty in Brockton, Massachusetts to the threshold of a heavyweight title shot, wanted to test Louis's claims. If the great Joe Louis believed that technique trumped power, that skill could neutralize strength, then why not find out if that was true? Rocky's trainer, Charlie Goldman, stepped forward. Joe, with all due respect, Rocky has a fight coming up. We cannot risk injury in some gym session. If you want to critique his style, that is your right. But let us not turn this into something that could derail his preparation. Joe Louis raised his hand calmly. I am not suggesting we spar. I would never ask that. Rocky is preparing for an important fight, and I respect that. But what I am offering is a demonstration. A technical demonstration. Rocky believes his strength and pressure are enough. I believe technique and skill can neutralize those attributes. So here is what I propose. Rocky and I will share the ring. Not to spar, not to fight, but to show principles. He will come forward as he does in fights, using his pressure and power. I will demonstrate how a skilled boxer responds, how technique creates opportunities that strength alone cannot force. No contact. No injury risk. Just education. An exchange of philosophies. Rocky looked at Charlie Goldman, who nodded slowly. It could be valuable, Rock. Seeing how a master like Joe moves, how he creates angles that could help you against better opposition down the road. Rocky turned back to Joe Louis. Okay, Mr. Louis. Let us do this demonstration. Show me how your technique beats my strength. But I will tell you now, I do not think you can stop me from coming forward. I have never been stopped, never been knocked down, never been made to take a backward step by any man. Your technique may be beautiful, but when I am in range, when I am throwing punches with bad intentions, we will see how much technique matters. The parameters were established quickly. They would move in the ring for 3 2-minute rounds, working at a pace that allowed demonstration of principles without risk of injury. Rocky would apply pressure, cutting off the ring, attempting to get inside and unload his power. Joe would show defensive movement, counters, and ring generalship. There would be no scoring, no winning or losing, just a technical exchange. But everyone in that gym knew this was more than a technical demonstration. This was a test of philosophies, a confrontation between old-school boxing science and new-school relentless aggression. They entered the ring, and immediately the physical difference was apparent. Rocky, at 5 feet 10 inches and 185 pounds, was shorter and stockier, all compact muscle and forward momentum. Joe, at 6 feet 1 inch and 210 pounds, was taller and more classically proportioned, with the long arms and fluid movement that had made him boxing's most elegant destroyer. Before we see what happened in this demonstration, before we reveal how these two philosophies collided and what the result teaches us about boxing, I need you to take action. Subscribe to this channel right now. We bring you the most incredible untold stories from boxing history, moments that shaped the sport but were never properly documented. Hit that like button if you appreciate content that goes deeper than surface-level boxing knowledge. Share this video with everyone who loves boxing history, who has debated old school versus new school approaches, who wants to understand what made the greatest fighters truly great. Comment below and tell me whose philosophy you think is correct. Can technique really stop raw power and aggression? Now let us see what Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano showed us that day. The bell rang, and Rocky immediately moved forward. His approach was exactly what Joe Louis had described, aggressive, straightforward, focused on closing distance and getting into punching range. His footwork was heavy but purposeful, cutting off angles, herding Joe toward the ropes. His hands were up but not in the textbook position, positioned more for offense than defense. His head movement was minimal, just enough to avoid getting hit cleanly while maintaining vision on his target. This was Rocky Marciano's style distilled to its essence, constant forward pressure backed by the confidence that his chin could absorb whatever counters came back. Joe Louis moved backward, but not in retreat. His movement was purposeful, tactical, creating angles that made Rocky adjust his pursuit. As Rocky pressed forward, Joe's jab snapped out, not hard, not meant to hurt, but precisely placed to measure distance and disrupt Rocky's rhythm. One jab, two jabs, three jabs, all finding their mark on Rocky's face and forehead. Rocky walked through them, continuing to press forward, showing that Louis's jab, while technically perfect, was not stopping his advance. But then Joe did something that changed the dynamic completely. As Rocky committed to a forward step, Joe pivoted laterally, moving to his left while simultaneously throwing a counter right hand that stopped just short of Rocky's jaw. The movement was so smooth, so perfectly timed, that Rocky found himself punching at empty space while Joe was in position to counter from an angle Rocky had not anticipated. Rocky reset quickly, adjusting his approach, trying to cut off Joe's escape routes more effectively. He pressed forward again, this time throwing a lead left hook designed to force Joe into a corner. But Joe slipped the hook with minimal movement, just enough to let the punch pass harmlessly, and again his counter right hand appeared from nowhere, stopping just before contact. Rocky had not been hit, but he had been shown something important. Joe's counters were landing in moments when Rocky was most vulnerable, when his own momentum carried him forward into positions where he could not defend. After 90 seconds of the first round, Rocky had pressed Joe to the ropes twice, but both times Joe had used footwork and positioning to escape without being trapped, and both times Joe's counters had found openings that Rocky had not realized he was leaving. The first round ended with Rocky breathing hard, not from exhaustion but from the intensity of his pursuit. Joe was barely winded, his movement economical and efficient. Charlie Goldman called Rocky over to the corner. "You see what he is doing, Rock? He is making you miss by inches, then countering when you are off balance. You are working twice as hard as he is, and he is the one creating the danger." Rocky nodded, his competitive fire building. "I see it. But I also see that he is moving backward. He is avoiding engagement. In a real fight, he would have to stand and trade eventually. Let me show you what happens when I actually land." The second round began with Rocky adjusting his strategy. Instead of purely chasing, he began to feint, to force Joe to react, to create openings by making Joe move first. This was Rocky showing unexpected ring intelligence, applying lessons learned from 43 professional fights. Joe responded by increasing his own offense, throwing combinations instead of single jabs, forcing Rocky to defend rather than purely attack. The pace increased, the intensity grew, and suddenly this demonstration felt like something more. For 30 seconds in the middle of the second round, they exchanged at a tempo that approached real fighting, Rocky throwing power shots that whooshed past Joe's head as Joe slipped and countered with punches that stopped inches from their targets. Then Rocky committed fully to a right hand, his signature punch, the blow that had knocked out 38 professional opponents. He loaded up, generated maximum power from his legs and core, and drove the punch toward Joe's head with every ounce of strength he possessed. It was the kind of punch that, if it landed cleanly, could change the outcome of any fight regardless of who was throwing it. But it did not land. Joe Louis, 37 years old, 2 years removed from retirement, moved his head just far enough to let the punch miss by a fraction of an inch. And in the same motion, as Rocky's momentum carried him forward and off balance, Joe threw a counter left hook that stopped so close to Rocky's jaw that Rocky actually felt the air displacement. The hook was thrown with textbook precision, perfect leverage, maximum efficiency of motion. If Joe had chosen to complete the punch with full power, Rocky would have been in serious trouble. The gym went silent. Rocky stepped back, his eyes wide. He had felt how vulnerable he was in that moment, had understood that Joe's counter would have landed clean while Rocky's biggest punch was missing. For the first time in his career, Rocky Marciano had experienced what it meant to be countered by a true master, to have his strength turned into a liability rather than an asset. The second round ended shortly after, and both men returned to their corners. Rocky's face showed a mixture of respect and determination. Joe's expression remained calm but thoughtful. The third round would decide what this demonstration ultimately meant. We are reaching the critical moment of this story, but before we continue, I need to ask you something. Are you seeing how this is different from typical boxing stories? This is not about hatred or rivalry. This is about two men testing fundamental questions about their sport. If you appreciate this depth of analysis, if you want to understand boxing at this level, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button. Share this video with everyone who loves combat sports, who debates technique versus power, who wants to understand what separated legends from champions. Comment below and tell me what you think Rocky learned from Joe Louis that day. Now let us see how this demonstration concluded and what it meant for both fighters. The third and final round began with a completely different energy. Rocky came forward again, but this time his movements showed awareness of what Joe had been teaching him. His footwork was slightly more measured. His head moved more consistently. He was still pressing forward, still applying pressure, but with greater respect for the counters that could come back. Joe, for his part, showed Rocky something new. Instead of purely defensive movement, Joe began to control the center of the ring, using his jab not just to measure but to dominate, to establish ownership of the space. His footwork kept Rocky at the end of his punches, always just far enough away that Rocky's shorter arms could not reach without overcommitting. For 90 seconds, they moved together in what looked like a carefully choreographed dance, but was actually the highest level of boxing technique on display. Joe's jab controlled distance and timing. Rocky's pressure forced Joe to work, to demonstrate his skills under duress. Joe's counters appeared whenever Rocky overextended. Rocky's conditioning allowed him to maintain pressure despite the frustration of constantly hitting air. Neither man was trying to hurt the other, but both were working at a level of intensity that revealed their true capabilities. And then, in the final 30 seconds of the final round, something remarkable happened. Rocky, perhaps frustrated by his inability to land cleanly, perhaps wanting to show Joe that he could adapt, changed his entire approach. He stopped trying to bull rush forward. Instead, he began to box. He used feints. He circled. He threw his jab to set up his right hand instead of just loading up on power shots. His movement became more fluid, less predictable. And for the first time in the entire demonstration, Joe Louis had to adjust his strategy to deal with a different Rocky Marciano. The final bell rang, and both men lowered their hands. They stood in the center of the ring, breathing hard, not from exhaustion but from the intensity of their exchange. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Joe Louis extended his hand, and Rocky took it. What followed was a conversation that only the two of them could hear fully, but those watching from ringside caught pieces of it. Joe spoke first, his voice quiet but sincere. "You have incredible strength and conditioning, Rocky. Your will to come forward, to apply pressure, to never stop, that is rare. Most men break when you do that to them. But what I hope I showed you today is that against a skilled opponent, against someone who understands angles and timing, strength alone is not enough. You have to be able to box. You have to be able to adapt. The last 30 seconds, when you changed your approach, that is when you became dangerous to me. That is when I had to work hardest. Your power is your foundation, but you need to build technique on top of that foundation." Rocky listened intently, his respect for Joe Louis evident in his expression. "Mr. Louis, I learned more in 6 minutes with you than in 6 months of regular training. You showed me my weaknesses. You made me understand that what I do works against most fighters, but against the very best, against someone with your skill, I have to be more complete. I am going to work on what you showed me. I am going to add to my game. But I also want you to know something. My strength, my conditioning, my ability to keep coming forward, those things are real. They matter. Technique is beautiful, but when I catch someone clean, when I land my power shots, the fight ends. I respect your skill, but I also believe in my approach." Joe nodded slowly. "You should believe in your approach, Rocky. It has gotten you this far, and it will carry you further. But let me tell you something I learned over 66 professional fights. The fighters who lasted, who won championships and defended them, were the ones who could do everything. Power and technique. Aggression and intelligence. Forward pressure and defensive responsibility. You have the power and aggression. Now add the rest. Become complete. Because I am telling you right now, the way you fight currently, you will beat 99% of the heavyweights in the world. But that last 1%, the truly elite fighters, they will exploit your weaknesses if you do not shore them up." They left the ring together, and the respect between them was palpable. Rocky went back to his training with renewed focus, working specifically on the technical elements Joe Louis had exposed. Joe continued his comeback preparations, though those who watched him closely noticed a change in his demeanor. He had demonstrated his skill, had shown that technique could neutralize power, but he had also felt something in that ring that concerned him. Rocky Marciano's pressure was relentless, inhuman. The conditioning that allowed him to maintain that pace was extraordinary. And in those final 30 seconds, when Rocky had started to box instead of just brawl, Joe had seen a glimpse of what Rocky could become if he truly developed his complete game. 4 months later, in October 1951, Rocky Marciano and Joe Louis would meet again, this time in an official fight at Madison Square Garden. The matchup was controversial, the old legend against the rising contender, but it was also inevitable. Joe Louis needed money and believed his skill could defeat Rocky's crude power. Rocky Marciano needed the credibility that only defeating Joe Louis could provide. That fight would be brutal and one-sided, with Rocky knocking Joe Louis down twice before stopping him in the 8th round. Joe would retire permanently after that defeat, his comeback attempt ending in the worst loss of his career. But those who knew about the May training session saw that October fight differently. They understood that Rocky had taken Joe's lessons to heart, had worked on his technique, had become more complete. They also understood that Joe, at 37, no longer had the physical gifts to execute the technique that his mind still understood perfectly. The story of this training session demonstration would not become widely known for decades. Both men spoke about it occasionally in interviews, always with respect for each other, but the full details remained private. Rocky would go on to become heavyweight champion, would retire undefeated at 49-0, would be remembered as one of the hardest punchers and most relentless fighters in boxing history. Joe Louis would be remembered as perhaps the greatest heavyweight champion ever, the standard against which all others were measured. But for those who understood what happened in Grossinger's Resort on May 23, 1951, the story revealed something profound about both men and about boxing itself. Rocky Marciano learned that day that his power and pressure, while devastating, were not sufficient against the highest level of opposition without technical refinement. He took that lesson seriously, worked on his boxing skills, and became a more complete fighter because of it. His later career would show influences of Joe Louis's technical approach blended with his natural aggressive style. Joe Louis learned something too, though it was a harder lesson. He learned that age and physical decline were beginning to erode the technical mastery that had defined his career. The counters that used to come naturally now required conscious thought. The movement that used to be effortless now demanded focus. And against an opponent like Rocky, who brought relentless pressure backed by inhuman conditioning, technique alone might not be enough if the physical tools to execute the technique were diminishing. Years later, in a 1969 interview, Rocky Marciano would be asked about his time training with Joe Louis before their official fight. His answer would reveal the depth of respect he had gained that day. Joe Louis taught me more about boxing in 6 minutes than anyone else taught me in 6 years. He showed me that I could not rely just on my strength and my chin. He made me understand that to be truly great, to beat the very best, I needed to be able to box, to move, to think in the ring. Everything I accomplished after that day was built on the foundation of what Joe showed me. He was the greatest heavyweight champion in history, and having him take time to teach me, to show me my weaknesses, that was a gift I never forgot. Joe Louis, in his autobiography published in 1978, would write about Rocky Marciano with similar respect but also with an acknowledgement of what Rocky represented. Rocky Marciano was the future of the heavyweight division in a way I did not fully understand until it was too late. I thought technique would always beat power, that skill would always defeat aggression. And in my prime, that was true. But Rocky showed me that if you combine great power with relentless conditioning and the willingness to continually improve, technique alone is not enough to stop you. He was crude when I first saw him train. But he learned. He adapted. He became better. And when we fought officially 4 months after our training session, I found out that the student had learned his lessons well. He beat me not just with power, but with the technique I had tried to teach him. The demonstration at Grossinger's Resort represents a perfect encapsulation of boxing's eternal debate. Technique versus power. Skill versus aggression. The old guard versus the new generation. What made it special was that both men were right. Joe Louis was correct that technique matters, that crude power can be neutralized by superior skill and ring intelligence. Rocky Marciano was correct that relentless pressure backed by extraordinary conditioning can overwhelm even the most technically perfect opponent. The truth, as both men came to understand, is that greatness in boxing requires both. Power without technique is limited. Technique without the physical attributes to execute it becomes theoretical. The complete fighter, the truly great champion, possesses both and knows when to emphasize each. Before I close this remarkable story, I want to make sure you understand why this content matters. We have just explored one of boxing's most important but least known encounters, a moment where two philosophies collided and both men learned from each other. If you have stayed with me through this entire journey, you clearly appreciate boxing history at a deeper level than most fans. So here is what you need to do right now. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already. We are dedicated to uncovering stories like this, moments that shaped boxing but were never properly documented. Hit that like button to help this video reach more boxing fans who need to hear these stories. Share this video everywhere you can, with boxing enthusiasts, with sports historians, with anyone who has ever debated whether technique or power matters more in fighting. And comment below with your thoughts. What is your biggest takeaway from Rocky Marciano and Joe Louis's training session? Do you think technique can overcome physical advantages, or does power ultimately decide fights? Your comments help keep these important conversations alive. Thank you for watching, and remember, the greatest lessons in boxing often happen in training gyms, away from crowds and cameras, where fighters test themselves honestly and learn from each other. That is where the truth emerges, and that is what we are here to share with you.